Yeah, I really like this one. So The Guardian, uh, the newspaper, has updated its style guide in order to have terms that more accurately, in its conception, describe environmental crises facing the world. And so some quintessential examples are that climate change is going to be replaced, or it should be preferred to, uh, should be replaced with preferred terms like climate emergency, climate crisis, or climate breakdown. Breakdown's an interesting one. And then global heating is favored over global warming. And the kind of summary quote from their editor in chief was that we want to ensure we are being scientifically precise while also communicating clearly with the readers on this very important issue. And I actually support this on precisely the same grounds. I think climate change is, as you've pointed out, a sloppy term, and climate emergency actually commits them to something specific, and it has a real contrast, since there's definitely climate emergency deniers. Although note, one of their other changes is that climate science denier should now be used to replace climate skeptic. But I mean, if I had to guess, I'd have to say that like this is so blatantly biased that it will have the opposite of its intended effect. That it's subtle bias is always more dangerous than obvious bias because it's harder to guard against. But I definitely support using very clearly loaded terminology, or at least more precise terminology.
Yeah, I actually wrote about this a little bit on Twitter because Stuart Brand, who's an interesting guy, the founder of the Whole Earth catalog, which Steve Jobs mentioned in his famous Stanford speech. Brand is an interesting guy because he's been on different parts of the environmental movement, or in different parts of the environmental movement. And he posted something about how he thought this was oversimplifying things. And then I responded. I forget exactly what I wrote, but I mentioned that what I like to try to do is I like to just try to come up with really clear terminology that captures the different kinds of cause and effect relationships that people agree on. And then you can use different magnitudes. So for instance, I'll talk about, okay, CO2 levels. That's a thing that, okay, we can agree on that. That's something that matters. We can talk about rising CO2 levels. And then we can talk about warming influence. Okay, what's the warming influence of rising CO2 levels? And then people can say, they could say it's an accelerating warming influence, or a decelerating warming influence, or a catastrophic warming influence. But they actually have to just talk clearly about the terminology is really capturing known things, and then the things that need to be argued for, you need to make clear. You can't just build them into the terminology. You need to actually argue for them or have some modification, like catastrophic warming influence. And so what these guys want to do is they just want to build in the most extreme conclusion, but build it into the baseline terminology. So to just act like, well, to discuss this issue is to adopt a particular theory of it. And there is, you can talk about that. I think you can with something like evolution, or you can do it when things are really established in a certain way. You can build them uh, into your conceptual vocabulary, but you have to really establish them. And even uh, with evolution. I don't know the specifics of to what degree what different aspects of evolution are established, but it seems good to to describe kind of the history. But even there, you run into difficulties because you're talking about, okay, well, we know that the that sort of life forms evolve in a certain way from simpler to more complex and stuff like that. But then within that, there are probably lots of different accounts in certain ways. And so you don't want to just equate evolution with one particular interpretation uh, of it. So this is the worst is importing moral terminology like crisis or emergency. I mean, that's just totally blending together science and then morality, and then just saying, oh, well, if you don't agree with me about the climate emergency, then you're against science.
Well, I think a relevant part of the context, Alex. So, like, even if you say certain science is settled, like evolution, which I agree with, when you're trying to impose policies, like, I think then you can't close off and like it's just in a different category of saying the science is settled among scientists versus the science is settled among scientists, and therefore we're going to impose a bunch of policies on you. Like, if you're going to base policy in something, then you have to be able to contest the science because something's going to be forced upon you. Whereas if it's just scientists, like I'm not going to base any of my life choices on evolution if that's not my field or if it's not relevant to my field. So it's not important that I understand the evidence for it in the same way. Whereas if you're going to impose something on everyone, I think like that you have to be objective to them about what the evidence is.
Yeah, good point.